The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert as Major Sarah Viper Martinez adjusted her helmet and stared at the A-10 Thunderbolt II sitting on the tarmac. The aircraft, affectionately known as the Warthog, looked more like a flying tank than a graceful fighter jet. Its massive 30mm cannon jutted from the nose like a predator's jaw, and its twin engines sat high on the fuselage, designed to keep running even when riddled with enemy fire. But today wasn't about combat readiness or standard training exercises. Today was about proving something that every military aviation expert, every seasoned pilot, and especially every member of SEAL Team 6 believed was absolutely impossible. "You can't fly that low and survive," Commander Jake Razor Thompson had said just hours earlier, his weathered face creased with certainty. He was a legend among Navy SEALs, a man who had survived missions that existed only in classified files. The physics don't work. The margin for error doesn't exist. One wrong move, one gust of wind, one moment of hesitation, and you're painting the desert floor. The challenge had been thrown down during a joint training exercise planning meeting. The mission called for close air support at an altitude so low it defied conventional wisdom. The SEALs needed air cover during a simulated hostage rescue in terrain so treacherous that standard attack runs would be useless. The target zone was surrounded by jagged rock formations that rose like ancient monuments from the desert floor, creating a maze of stone corridors barely wide enough for a helicopter, let alone a fixed-wing aircraft. Impossible, the SEAL commander had declared. No pilot crazy enough to try it, and no aircraft built to handle it. That's when Major Martinez had quietly stood up from her seat at the back of the briefing room. Every eye in the room turned to the 34-year-old Air Force pilot who had earned her call sign Viper not for aggression, but for her ability to strike with precision when others couldn't even see the target. "I'll do it," she had said simply. The room erupted in skeptical laughter. Here was a woman who stood barely 5'6", challenging the assessment of America's most elite Special Forces unit. But those who knew Major Martinez's record weren't laughing. She was the pilot who had saved an entire Marine platoon by flying through a sandstorm that grounded every other aircraft in theater. She was the aviator who had landed a damaged A-10 with one engine gone and half her controls shot away, bringing her wounded co-pilot home alive. Now, as she performed her pre-flight inspection, Sarah could hear the murmur of voices from the observation tower. Word had spread quickly through the base. Pilots from every squadron had found reasons to be near the flight line. Ground crews had positioned themselves along the runway. Even the base commander had quietly taken a position where he could watch the proceedings. The bet was simple: Major Martinez would attempt to fly her A-10 through a course marked by GPS coordinates that would take her between rock formations with clearances measured in feet, not yards. She would maintain an altitude so low that her landing gear would nearly scrape the desert floor. She would do this at speeds that would give her milliseconds to react to changing conditions. And she would do it while maintaining radio contact with a simulated ground team, proving that such a flight profile could actually support a real mission. The SEALs had set what they considered generous parameters. They didn't expect her to complete the full course. They figured she'd abort the mission when reality set in, when the physics of flight met the unforgiving nature of the Nevada landscape. They were about to learn that Major Sarah Martinez didn't believe in impossible. As she climbed into the cockpit of her A-10, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before every challenging flight. But this was different. This wasn't about proving herself to skeptical instructors or earning respect from male colleagues who questioned whether women belonged in combat aircraft. This was about pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible, about showing that innovation and skill could overcome conventional limitations. The radio crackled to life as she began her engine start sequence. "Viper 1, this is Tower. You are cleared for departure when ready." Good luck up there." Sarah smiled as she ran through her final checks. The A-10's twin turbofan engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The aircraft vibrated around her, eager to take flight. "Tower, Viper 1 ready for departure. Time to show these SEALs what impossible looks like." What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a story told in pilot-ready rooms and special operations briefings for years to come. It would challenge everything the military thought it knew about low-level flight operations and change the way close air support missions were planned and executed. But first, Major Sarah Martinez had to survive the next 30 minutes. The story of Major Sarah Martinez began long before that fateful morning in the Nevada desert. Born in a small town in Texas, Sarah had been fascinated by aircraft since childhood. Her father, a mechanic at a local airfield, would take her to work on weekends where she would watch crop dusters take off and land, marveling at how something so heavy could defy gravity with such apparent ease. Growing up in the 1990s, Sarah faced constant reminders that aviation was considered a man's world. Her high school guidance counselor tried to steer her toward more appropriate careers when she expressed interest in becoming a military pilot. "Maybe you should consider becoming an air traffic controller instead," the woman had suggested with what she probably thought was kindness. "It's still aviation related, but more suitable for someone like you." Sarah had politely thanked the counselor and, then, spent the next 4 years proving her wrong. She excelled in mathematics and physics, earning a full scholarship to the Air Force Academy. Even there, she faced skepticism from some instructors who questioned whether women had the physical and mental toughness required for combat aviation. The doubt only made her more determined. She graduated third in her class and was selected for fighter training, where she quickly established herself as one of the most naturally gifted pilots in her squadron. Her instructors noted her exceptional spatial awareness and ability to remain calm under pressure. More importantly, she demonstrated an almost intuitive understanding of aircraft performance that couldn't be taught in textbooks. When it came time to select her aircraft assignment, Sarah surprised everyone by requesting the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Most pilots with her scores and rankings chose sleek fighters like the F-16 or F-15. The A-10 was considered the unglamorous workhorse of the Air Force fleet, designed for the dangerous mission of close air support rather than the glory of air-to-air combat. "Why the Warthog?" her squadron commander had asked during her assignment interview. Sarah's answer was simple and direct: because it's the aircraft that saves lives on the ground. Everything else is just flying around looking pretty. Her first deployment to Afghanistan came in 2015, during a time when American ground forces were still heavily engaged in combat operations. The A-10 community was tight-knit, and Sarah quickly earned the respect of her fellow pilots through her performance in combat. She had a gift for finding targets that others missed and could deliver ordnance with surgical precision even in the most challenging conditions. It was during her second combat tour that she earned her call sign Viper. During a particularly intense battle in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, a special forces team had become pinned down by enemy fire from a position so well hidden that multiple attack aircraft had been unable to locate the threat. The soldiers on the ground were taking casualties, and their ammunition was running low. Sarah arrived on station just as the situation was becoming desperate. While other pilots circled at safe altitudes, she brought her A-10 down into the valley, flying so low that she could see the individual faces of the American soldiers pressed against the rocky terrain. She systematically searched every possible hiding place, using her aircraft's sensors and her own eyes to hunt for the enemy position. When she finally spotted the carefully camouflaged bunker, she had to thread her aircraft between two mountain peaks to get the angle she needed for an effective attack. The space between the peaks was barely wider than her A-10's wingspan, and the winds in the valley were unpredictable and dangerous. Her wingman advised her to abort the attack and wait for artillery support. Instead, Sarah lined up for the most precise gun run of her career. She dove her aircraft into the narrow canyon, fighting crosswinds that tried to slam her into the mountainside, and delivered a burst from her 30mm cannon that destroyed the enemy position in a shower of rock and steel. The Special Forces team was able to complete their extraction without further casualties. That was like watching a Viper strike, the ground team leader had radioed after the battle. Fast, precise, and deadly. The call sign stuck. Word of Sarah's flying abilities spread throughout the special operations community. Her reputation grew with each deployment, and she became the pilot that ground commanders specifically requested when missions required exceptional precision or involved unusual risk. She had saved the lives of dozens of American soldiers through her willingness to take calculated risks that other pilots avoided. But it was her performance during a mission in Syria that really set her apart from her peers. An American convoy had been ambushed in a narrow urban street, trapped between buildings with enemy fighters positioned on rooftops all around them. The proximity of civilian buildings made the use of conventional weapons extremely risky, and the narrow streets prevented most aircraft from getting the angles needed for effective gun runs. Sarah arrived to find chaos on the ground. The convoy was stopped in the middle of the street, taking fire from multiple directions. Several vehicles were burning, and wounded Americans were pinned down behind inadequate cover. The mission commander was preparing to order the surviving soldiers to abandon their vehicles and attempt to escape on foot, almost certainly resulting in additional casualties. That's when Sarah made a decision that would have ended the career of most pilots. She brought her A-10 down to street level, literally flying between the buildings at an altitude so low that her landing gear nearly scraped the pavement. She had to bank her aircraft almost vertically to navigate around power lines and satellite dishes, all while maintaining precise control of her weapons systems. Flying at less than 50 feet above the ground, she methodically eliminated each enemy position with carefully aimed bursts from her cannon. The precision required was extraordinary. Too high and she would hit civilian structures; too low and she risked hitting friendly forces. The margin for error was measured in inches, and she was flying at nearly 300 miles per hour. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, but, when it was over, the convoy was able to continue its mission with no additional American casualties. The gun camera footage from her aircraft became legendary within the A-10 community, studied by pilots who couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was performances like these that earned Sarah a reputation as the most skilled low-level pilot in the Air Force. She had an almost supernatural ability to fly in conditions that would challenge a helicopter, let alone a fixed-wing aircraft. Her aircraft became an extension of her will, responding to her touch with precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics. By the time she reached the rank of major, Sarah had logged over 2,000 combat hours and had been decorated multiple times for her actions under fire. She was considered one of the most valuable close air support pilots in the entire military, with a waiting list of ground commanders who wanted her assigned to their operations. But, despite all her achievements, she still faced skepticism from some corners of the military establishment. The special operations community, in particular, remained dominated by a culture that questioned whether anyone who wasn't part of their elite brotherhood could truly understand the demands of their missions. This attitude was on full display during the joint training exercise that would change everything. SEAL Team 6 was planning a complex hostage rescue mission in terrain that posed unprecedented challenges for air support. The target was located in a series of narrow canyons surrounded by towering rock formations, with approaches that would challenge even the most experienced helicopter pilots. The mission planners had been struggling for weeks to develop an air support plan that could provide effective cover for the ground team. Traditional attack patterns were impossible due to the terrain, and the limited airspace meant that any supporting aircraft would be extremely vulnerable to ground fire. Commander Jake Thompson, the SEAL team leader, was a 30-year veteran of special operations. He had participated in some of the most dangerous missions in recent military history, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the deserts of Iraq. His experience had taught him to be realistic about what was and wasn't possible in combat situations. When the air support briefing began, Thompson listened politely as various options were presented. Attack helicopters could provide some support, but their limited speed and armor made them sitting ducks in the confined space. Fast-moving fighter aircraft could deliver ordnance, but their speed and minimum altitude requirements meant they couldn't provide the precision needed for a hostage rescue situation. The briefing officer concluded by recommending that the mission be postponed until a better location could be identified or alternative support arrangements could be made. The terrain, he argued, simply didn't allow for effective air support using conventional tactics. That's when Thompson stood up and delivered his assessment with the blunt honesty that had made him famous throughout the special operations community. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been in more firefights than most people at hot meals, "I appreciate the creativity that's gone into these proposals, but let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. This terrain is a death trap for aircraft. The approaches are too narrow, the altitude requirements are too restrictive, and the margin for error is non-existent." He clicked to the next slide, showing a detailed topographical map of the target area. The rock formations looked like a maze designed by a sadistic architect, with passages that twisted and turned between towering stone walls. To provide effective support in this environment, an aircraft would need to fly at an altitude of less than 100 feet above the deck, navigate between rock formations with clearances measured in feet, and maintain enough precision to engage targets within meters of friendly forces. It's simply not possible with current aircraft and tactics. Thompson's assessment was met with nods of agreement from most of the room. The physics of flight seemed to support his conclusion. Aircraft needed altitude to maneuver safely, and the confined space of the canyon system eliminated that safety margin entirely. "I've seen what happens when pilots try to fly too low in confined terrain," Thompson continued, his voice taking on the somber tone of someone recounting personal loss. "I've called in air support that never made it home because the pilot thought he could thread the needle. This isn't about courage or skill, it's about the fundamental limitations of aircraft performance." The room was quiet as Thompson concluded his presentation. His reputation and experience carried enormous weight, and few people were willing to challenge his assessment. The mission would have to be redesigned around the reality that effective air support simply wasn't feasible. That's when Major Sarah Martinez quietly stood up from her seat at the back of the room. She had been attending the briefing as an observer, representing the A-10 community's input on the proposed mission. Her presence had been more of a formality than anything else. Everyone assumed that the mission requirements were beyond the capabilities of any fixed-wing aircraft. "Commander Thompson," she said, her voice calm and respectful, "I appreciate your experience and your concern for pilot safety. But I think you're underestimating what's possible with the right aircraft and the right pilot." The room turned to look at the woman who was challenging one of the most respected special operations leaders in the military. Sarah was used to being the only woman in rooms full of men, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, and the skepticism was more intense. Thompson looked at her with the expression of a patient teacher addressing a naive student. "Major, I've seen more aircraft go down in situations like this than you've probably flown combat missions. This isn't about being negative, it's about being realistic." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his experience while maintaining her position. "I understand your concern, Commander. But the A-10 isn't like other aircraft. It was designed specifically for low-level operations in hostile environments. And, with the right flight profile, I believe it's possible to provide the support your mission requires." The skeptical murmur that ran through the room was almost audible. Here was a relatively young pilot, regardless of her combat record, suggesting that she could accomplish something that seasoned special operations veterans considered impossible. Thompson's expression hardened slightly. He wasn't used to having his tactical assessments challenged, especially by someone outside the special operations community. "Major, no disrespect, but flying low over Afghanistan is very different from what we're talking about here. The margins we're dealing with would challenge a helicopter pilot, let alone someone in a fixed-wing aircraft." Sarah felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven her throughout her career. She had heard variations of this conversation many times before, well-meaning professionals explaining why something couldn't be done, usually with the underlying assumption that she, in particular, couldn't do it. "Commander," she said, stepping forward to address the room more directly, "I've been flying close air support missions for 8 years. I've put ordnance on targets in urban environments with civilian structures less than 50 meters away. I've flown through mountain valleys in Afghanistan where the peaks were higher than my altitude. I've provided support in conditions that other pilots considered impossible." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "The A-10 was built for this kind of mission. It has the low-speed handling characteristics needed for confined areas, the armor to survive in a high-threat environment, and the precision weapons systems needed to engage targets near friendly forces. What you're describing as impossible is exactly what this aircraft was designed to do." Thompson studied her for a long moment, weighing her words against his experience. He had worked with many pilots over the years, and he had learned to distinguish between confidence and overconfidence. Something in Sarah's manner suggested that her assessment was based on more than just optimism. "All right, Major," he said finally. "Let's say for a moment that you're right about your aircraft's capabilities. Do you really believe you could fly the profile we're talking about? We're not discussing a standard close air support mission. We're talking about flying at altitudes and in terrain that would be challenging for a bird, let alone an aircraft weighing 30,000 pounds. Sarah met his gaze directly. "Give me the coordinates and the mission parameters, Commander. Let me prove it to you." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. The room was completely silent as Thompson considered her proposal. On one hand, his experience and training told him that what she was suggesting was beyond the realm of possibility. On the other hand, her confidence was compelling, and her combat record was impressive. "You're serious about this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Dead serious," Sarah replied. "Set up a training scenario that replicates your mission requirements. If I can't fly the profile safely and effectively, then you're right and the mission needs to be redesigned. But if I can do what I say I can do, then maybe it's time to reconsider what's possible." Thompson looked around the room, seeing a mixture of skepticism and curiosity on the faces of the other officers. The proposed test would be expensive and potentially dangerous, but it would also settle the question definitively. "What exactly are you proposing, Major?" he asked. Sarah moved to the front of the room and pointed to the topographical display showing the target area. "We set up a training course that replicates these terrain features. I'll fly my A-10 through the course at the altitudes and speeds that would be required for your mission. I'll demonstrate engagement procedures, evasive maneuvers, and extraction protocols. You can evaluate whether the performance meets your mission requirements." She paused, then added the words that would make the challenge irresistible to the competitive SEALs: "If I can't complete the course to your satisfaction, I'll recommend that the mission be scrapped. But if I can do what I'm claiming, then you have to admit that you were wrong about what's possible." The room erupted in quiet conversations as officers discussed the implications of her proposal. This wasn't just about one mission anymore, it was about challenging fundamental assumptions about aircraft capabilities and pilot limitations. Thompson raised his hand for silence, his decision made. "All right, Major Martinez. You've got yourself a test. We'll set up a course in Nevada that replicates the terrain and mission requirements. You'll have one chance to prove that what you're claiming is possible." He stood up, his full authority now focused on the challenge ahead. "But understand this, we're not talking about a routine training exercise. The parameters you'll be flying are at the absolute edge of what's survivable. If you're wrong about your capabilities, the consequences could be fatal." Sarah nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of what she was undertaking. "I understand, Commander. And I'm ready to prove that impossible is just another word for something no one has tried yet." As the briefing broke up and officers began filing out of the room, word of the challenge spread quickly through the base. By evening, it seemed like everyone on the installation had heard about the female A-10 pilot who had challenged the assessment of SEAL Team 6. The test was scheduled for the following week, giving Sarah time to prepare and the mission planners time to set up a course that would truly test her claims. The location chosen was a remote area of the Nevada test and training range, where the terrain naturally replicated the challenges of the proposed mission area. As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she felt the weight of what she had committed to. She had put her reputation, her career, and potentially her life on the line to prove a point about what was possible. But she also felt the familiar excitement that came with pushing the boundaries of flight. She had 7 days to prepare for the most challenging flight of her career, and she intended to make the most of them. The stage was set for a confrontation between experience and innovation, between conventional wisdom and individual skill. In one corner stood the accumulated expertise of America's most elite special operations forces, backed by decades of hard-won experience about the limitations of military aviation. In the other corner stood a single pilot with an unshakable belief that those limitations were about to be redefined. The desert would soon witness a demonstration that would change military aviation forever, assuming Major Sarah Martinez survived long enough to complete it. The week between the challenge and the test flight passed like a blur of intense preparation. Major Sarah Martinez knew that she would get only one chance to prove her point, and failure would not only end the discussion about the mission but could also damage her credibility for years to come. The pressure was enormous, but Sarah had learned long ago to channel pressure into focus. Her first step was to study every piece of available data about the terrain where the test would take place. The Nevada test and training range contained some of the most challenging flying terrain in North America, with rocky canyons, sudden elevation changes, and unpredictable wind patterns that had claimed more than a few aircraft over the years. Using satellite imagery, topographical maps, and weather data, Sarah began to construct a mental picture of the challenges she would face. The course that had been laid out for her test flight wound through a series of narrow canyons between towering red rock formations, some rising over 1,000 feet above the desert floor. The GPS waypoints marked a path that would require her to fly at altitudes barely above the canyon floor, with margins for error measured in feet rather than the hundreds of feet that were standard for military aviation. The more she studied the course, the more she understood why Commander Thompson and his team considered it impossible. The physics of flight seemed to work against everything she was trying to accomplish. At the low altitudes required, her aircraft would be operating in ground effect, where the airflow around the wings became unpredictable. The confined space between canyon walls would create wind shear and turbulence that could easily slam an aircraft into solid rock before the pilot could react. But Sarah also began to see opportunities that others had missed. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was unlike any other aircraft in the Air Force inventory. Where most military aircraft were designed for speed and high-altitude performance, the A-10 was built like a flying tank, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment and continuing to fly. Its massive, straight wings provided exceptional lift at low speeds, and its twin turbofan engines were positioned high on the fuselage to reduce the risk of foreign object damage from debris kicked up during low-level flight. More importantly, the A-10's flight characteristics at low speed were almost helicopter-like. While other jet aircraft became unstable and difficult to control as they approached their minimum flying speeds, the A-10 remained controllable and responsive. This would be crucial for navigating the tight turns and confined spaces of the canyon system. Sarah spent hours in the flight simulator, running through variations of the planned course until she could fly it in her sleep. She practiced emergency procedures, evasive maneuvers, and the precise weapons delivery techniques that would be required for the actual mission. The simulator couldn't perfectly replicate the challenges of real canyon flying, but it allowed her to rehearse her responses to various scenarios until they became instinctive. The weapons aspect of the demonstration was particularly challenging. It wasn't enough to simply fly through the canyon system, she would also need to demonstrate that she could effectively engage targets while maintaining the extreme low-level flight profile. This meant coordinating weapons systems, navigation, and aircraft control simultaneously while flying in conditions that demanded her complete attention. To make the demonstration as realistic as possible, the test planners had placed target arrays throughout the canyon system. These targets represented enemy positions that would need to be neutralized during an actual rescue mission, and Sarah would be expected to engage them with her 30mm cannon while maintaining her low-level flight path. The precision required was extraordinary. At the speeds she would be flying, she would have only seconds to identify, target, and engage each position. The margin for error was essentially zero. A miss could mean hitting friendly forces in an actual mission, while overcorrection could result in flying into a canyon wall. As the week progressed, word of the upcoming test spread throughout the military aviation community. Pilots from bases across the country found reasons to visit Nevada during that week, hoping to witness what many were calling either a historic demonstration of pilot skill or a catastrophic validation of conventional wisdom about the limits of aircraft performance. The attention added to the pressure Sarah was feeling, but it also reinforced her determination to succeed. She knew that failure would be used as evidence that women didn't belong in combat aviation, regardless of her impressive combat record. The test had become about more than just mission planning, it was about proving that skill and innovation could overcome prejudice and conventional limitations. 3 days before the test, Sarah was approached by Colonel James Morrison, the base commander and a highly experienced pilot himself. Morrison had been following the preparations with interest and growing concern about the risks involved. "Sarah," he said, using her first name in a way that indicated this was a personal conversation rather than an official one, "I want to make sure you understand what you're getting into here. I've been flying for 25 years, and I've seen good pilots die because they pushed the envelope too far." Sarah appreciated the colonel's concern, but she also heard the underlying message that had followed her throughout her career. "Colonel, I understand the risks. But I also understand the capabilities of my aircraft and my own limitations. This isn't about ego or proving a point, it's about expanding the boundaries of what we consider possible." Morrison studied her for a moment, seeing the quiet confidence that had made her such an effective combat pilot. "I've read your service record, Major. Your combat performance has been exemplary. But this is different. Combat situations at least allow for some unpredictability in your favor. The enemy might miss, equipment might malfunction in your favor, weather might provide cover when you need it. The laws of physics don't offer that kind of flexibility." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. "You're right, sir. Physics doesn't negotiate. But physics also made it possible for the Wright brothers to fly when everyone said it was impossible. It made it possible for Chuck Yeager to break the sound barrier when everyone said the aircraft would disintegrate. Sometimes the difference between impossible and inevitable is just finding the right approach." The colonel smiled at her reference to aviation history, but his expression remained serious. "Those pioneers had something you don't have, Sarah. They had the luxury of failing privately. If this test goes wrong, it won't just end your career, it will be used as evidence that certain types of missions simply aren't feasible. The implications go far beyond your personal situation." The weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on Sarah. She understood that she was carrying the expectations and doubts of an entire community of aviators and ground forces. Success would open new possibilities for close air support missions and potentially save lives in future operations. Failure would close those possibilities, perhaps permanently. "I understand the stakes, Colonel," she said quietly. "That's exactly why I have to succeed." 2 days before the test, Sarah received an unexpected visit from Master Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, one of the most experienced A-10 crew chiefs in the Air Force. Rodriguez had been working on Warthogs for over 15 years and had seen more combat deployments than most pilots. His opinion carried enormous weight in the A-10 community. "Ma'am," Rodriguez began, "I heard about what you're planning to do out there. I wanted to talk to you about your aircraft preparation." Sarah welcomed the input. Rodriguez's expertise in A-10 systems was legendary, and his insights could make the difference between success and failure. "What are you thinking, Sergeant?" Rodriguez pulled out a detailed maintenance checklist that went far beyond standard pre-flight procedures. "For what you're planning to do, we need to ensure that every system on your aircraft is operating at peak performance. The margin for equipment failure is essentially zero, so we need to eliminate any possibility of mechanical problems." Over the next several hours, Rodriguez walked Sarah through a comprehensive review of her aircraft's systems. They checked and double-checked everything from engine performance to flight control responsiveness. The crew chief's attention to detail was extraordinary. He insisted on replacing components that were still within acceptable operational parameters but weren't performing at absolute peak efficiency. "Ma'am," Rodriguez explained as he supervised the replacement of a flight control actuator. "In normal operations, this actuator would be fine for another few hundred flight hours. But, for what you're doing, you need instant response to control inputs. A delay of even a few milliseconds could be the difference between clearing that canyon wall and becoming part of it." The aircraft that emerged from Rodriguez's preparations was essentially a brand new machine. Every system had been optimized for the extreme demands of canyon flying, and every component had been tested to ensure peak performance. Sarah felt more confident knowing that her aircraft would respond precisely to her commands, without the small delays and imprecisions that were normal in military aviation. The day before the test, the observers began arriving. Representatives from every major command in the Air Force found reasons to be present, along with officers from other services who wanted to see whether the claims about A-10 capabilities were valid. The crowd included generals, combat veterans, test pilots, and aviation engineers, a gathering of expertise that would have been impressive under any circumstances. Commander Thompson arrived with several members of his SEAL team, still skeptical but curious to see whether Major Martinez could back up her confident claims. The SEALs had set up observation posts throughout the canyon system, equipped with cameras and measurement equipment that would document every aspect of the flight. "Major," Thompson said during the final mission briefing, "I have to admit that your preparation has been impressive. But I want to make sure you understand that we'll be measuring your performance against real mission requirements, not training standards. If you can't demonstrate that this flight profile would be effective in an actual combat situation, then the test doesn't prove anything." Sarah appreciated his directness. "Commander, I wouldn't ask for it any other way. The only way this demonstration has value is if it proves that the mission you're planning is not only possible but practical." The final briefing covered every aspect of the planned flight. Sarah would enter the canyon system at a predetermined point and follow a course marked by GPS waypoints. She would maintain an altitude of no more than 100 feet above the canyon floor, navigate through passages with clearances as narrow as 200 feet, and engage target array's position throughout the course. The flight would conclude with a simulated close air support scenario where Sarah would need to provide cover for a ground team while they extracted from a confined landing zone. This portion of the test would require her to loiter in the canyon system while maintaining her low-level flight profile, demonstrating that the aircraft could provide sustained support rather than just a single high-speed pass. Weather conditions for the test were forecast to be challenging but flyable. Winds in the canyon system were expected to be variable and unpredictable, with gusts that could create significant turbulence. The temperature would be high enough to reduce aircraft performance, adding another layer of difficulty to an already challenging flight. As Sarah completed her final preparations, she felt the familiar mix of excitement and nervous energy that preceded every significant flight. But there was something different this time, a sense that she was about to attempt something that would be remembered long after her military career ended. The crew chief who would be supporting her aircraft approached with the final maintenance report. "Ma'am, your bird is as ready as we can make her. All systems are green, all performance parameters are nominal. She'll do whatever you ask of her." Sarah thanked the crew chief and began her personal preparation ritual. She spent 30 minutes in quiet meditation, visualizing every aspect of the flight until she could see the entire course in her mind's eye. She reviewed emergency procedures and abort criteria, making sure she was prepared for any situation that might arise. Finally, she reviewed the reasons why this flight mattered. It wasn't just about proving that the mission was possible, it was about expanding the boundaries of what military aviation could accomplish. If successful, this demonstration would lead to new tactics and procedures that could save lives in future conflicts. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the rock formations in brilliant shades of red and orange, Sarah felt ready for the challenge ahead. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or failure, success or catastrophe. But, whatever happened, she would face it with the confidence that came from thorough preparation and absolute commitment to excellence. The stage was set for a demonstration that would either revolutionize military aviation or serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing too far beyond accepted limitations. Major Sarah Martinez had spent her career proving that conventional wisdom wasn't always wise, and tomorrow she would find out whether that philosophy could survive the ultimate test. In 12 hours, she would either make history or become part of it. The difference would be measured in feet, seconds, and the razor-thin margin between possible and impossible that defined the world of military aviation. The desert waited in silence, keeping its own counsel about what the morning would bring. Dawn broke over the Nevada desert with the crisp clarity that only existed in the high desert, where the thin air and endless horizon combined to create visibility that seemed to stretch forever. Major Sarah Martinez had been awake for 2 hours already, going through her personal pre-flight ritual with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 8 years of combat flying. The flight line was busier than usual for such an early hour. Word of the demonstration had spread throughout the base and beyond, drawing observers who wanted to witness what many were calling either a breakthrough in military aviation or an expensive demonstration of pilot overconfidence. Ground crews moved around Sarah's A-10 with unusual attention to detail, checking and rechecking systems that had already been verified multiple times. Sarah appreciated their thoroughness, but she also knew that at some point preparation had to give way to execution. She had done everything possible to ready herself and her aircraft for the challenge ahead. Now it was time to find out whether her confidence was justified or misplaced. The weather briefing confirmed what she had expected: conditions would be challenging but flyable. Winds in the canyon system were forecast to be variable, with gusts up to 30 knots that could create significant turbulence in the confined spaces between rock walls. The temperature was already climbing toward what would be a scorching day, which would reduce her aircraft's performance and make precise control more difficult. Commander Thompson approached as Sarah completed her external inspection of the aircraft. Despite his skepticism about the mission, she could see a grudging respect in his eyes for her thorough preparation and professional demeanor. "Major," he said, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens out there today, I respect what you're attempting. It takes courage to put your reputation on the line like this." Sarah appreciated the gesture, understanding that it represented a significant acknowledgement from someone who had initially dismissed her capabilities. "Thank you, Commander. I hope to change your mind about what's possible out there. Just remember," Thompson added, "the abort criteria we discussed. If conditions become unsafe at any point, get out of there. Proving a point isn't worth dying for." Sarah nodded, though they both knew that the line between acceptable risk and recklessness would be defined by split-second decisions made while flying at 300 miles per hour through terrain that offered no second chances. The final briefing took place in a crowded room filled with more rank and experience than Sarah had seen in one place since her graduation from the Air Force Academy. Generals, test pilots, combat veterans, and aviation engineers had all found reasons to be present for what was being called the most significant demonstration of aircraft capabilities in recent memory. The mission parameters were reviewed one final time. Sarah would enter the canyon system at waypoint Alpha, flying at no more than 100 feet above the canyon floor. She would navigate through a series of increasingly challenging passages, engaging target arrays with her 30mm cannon while maintaining precise control of her aircraft's position and speed. The most challenging portion of the flight would come at waypoint Delta, where the canyon narrowed to barely 200 feet wide while making a sharp 90-degree turn. At the speed Sarah would be flying, she would have to begin her turn before she could see around the corner, relying on GPS navigation and her own spatial awareness to avoid flying into solid rock. The demonstration would conclude with a simulated close air support scenario where Sarah would need to provide cover for a hypothetical ground team while they extracted from a confined landing zone. This would require her to loiter in the canyon system for several minutes, demonstrating that the extreme low-level flight profile could be sustained rather than just briefly achieved. Throughout the briefing, Sarah could feel the weight of expectation and skepticism in the room. Some observers clearly hoped she would succeed, seeing an opportunity for revolutionary advances in close air support capabilities. Others seemed to be waiting for confirmation that her claims were unrealistic, validation of their belief that certain missions were simply beyond the capabilities of current technology and training. As the briefing concluded and participants moved toward the observation areas, Sarah felt the familiar transformation that occurred before every significant flight. The nervous energy and social pressure faded away, replaced by the calm focus that came from years of flying in dangerous situations. Her world narrowed to include only the essential elements: her aircraft, the mission, and the skills she had developed over thousands of hours of flight time. The walk to her aircraft felt longer than usual, though she knew it was exactly the same distance she had covered hundreds of times before. Ground crews stepped aside respectfully as she approached, offering quiet words of encouragement and support. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting by the cockpit ladder, ready to help her with the final preparations. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said as she began strapping into the cockpit, "this bird is ready to do whatever you ask of her. All systems are green, all performance parameters are optimal. She's never been in better condition." Sarah appreciated his confidence, but she also knew that the success or failure of the mission would depend more on her skills than on the aircraft's condition. The A-10 was a proven platform with excellent low-level characteristics, but what she was attempting would push those characteristics to their absolute limits. The engine start sequence proceeded normally, with both turbofan engines spinning up to idle with their characteristic whine. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checks with the thoroughness that had become instinctive, verifying that every system was responding correctly and every parameter was within acceptable limits. Radio checks confirmed that communication was clear with all monitoring stations. The observer's position throughout the canyon system would be able to track her progress and provide real-time feedback on her performance. More importantly, they would be able to call for emergency assistance if something went wrong during the demonstration. As she completed her final preparations, Sarah allowed herself a moment to reflect on the path that had brought her to this point. From the small-town girl who had been told that flying wasn't appropriate for someone like her, to the combat veteran who was about to attempt something that military aviation experts considered impossible, the journey had been marked by a consistent refusal to accept conventional limitations. "Viper 1, this is Tower," came the radio call that indicated it was time to begin. "You are cleared for taxi when ready. All monitoring stations report ready to observe." "Tower, Viper 1 copies. Taxiing for departure." The taxi to the runway gave Sarah a few more minutes to settle into the mental state that would be required for the challenge ahead. She reviewed the flight path one final time, visualizing each waypoint and the specific challenges it would present. The canyon system she was about to enter had been chosen specifically because it replicated the most demanding aspects of the proposed mission area. At the runway threshold, Sarah paused for a final systems check. Everything was normal, and weather conditions were within acceptable parameters. The moment of truth had arrived. "Tower, Viper 1 ready for departure. Viper 1, cleared for takeoff. Good luck out there." The takeoff was routine, but Sarah knew that routine was about to end very quickly. As she climbed away from the airfield, she could see the Red Rock Canyon system spreading out before her like a maze designed by nature to challenge the skills of aviators. The first waypoint was located at the entrance to the canyon system, where the broad desert floor suddenly narrowed into a passage between towering rock walls. From her altitude of 5,000 feet, the canyon looked deceptively manageable. But Sarah knew that perspective would change dramatically as she descended into the confined space below. "Monitoring stations, this is Viper 1 approaching waypoint Alpha. Beginning descent for low-level ingress." The descent felt like diving into another world. As her altitude decreased, the rock walls seemed to grow higher and closer, creating an increasingly confined environment that challenged every instinct Sarah had developed as a pilot. Every aspect of her training emphasized the importance of altitude as a safety margin, but this mission required her to give up that margin entirely. At 1,000 feet above the canyon floor, the character of the flight changed completely. The smooth air of higher altitudes gave way to the turbulent, unpredictable conditions created by wind flowing over and around the complex rock formations. Sarah's aircraft began experiencing the constant small jolts and buffeting that would characterize the entire flight. 500 feet above the canyon floor, she could see individual rocks and vegetation on the ground below. The sensation of speed, which was barely noticeable at higher altitudes, became overwhelming as the landscape rushed past her cockpit. She was flying at nearly 300 miles per hour through terrain that seemed to demand helicopter speeds and helicopter maneuverability. At the prescribed altitude of 100 feet above the canyon floor, Sarah felt as though she was flying through a different universe. The rock walls rose on either side of her aircraft like the walls of a cathedral, creating a sense of enclosure that was both beautiful and terrifying. The margin for error that had seemed abstract during planning became viscerally real as she realized that a moment's inattention or a sudden gust of wind could end the flight catastrophically. "Waypoint Alpha achieved," she radioed. Proceeding to Bravo. The first target array appeared around a bend in the canyon, positioned on a ledge that would represent an enemy observation post in an actual mission. Engaging the target required Sarah to coordinate weapons systems, navigation, and aircraft control while flying at an altitude that left no room for error. The A-10's heads-up display showed the target clearly, and Sarah lined up for a gun run that would test both her marksmanship and her ability to maintain precise aircraft control. The 30mm cannon erupted with its characteristic growl, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds into the target array with devastating accuracy. Direct hit on Target 1, came the confirmation from the ground observers. Continuing to Waypoint Bravo. The second waypoint required Sarah to navigate through a passage that narrowed significantly, with rock walls that seemed close enough to touch from her cockpit. The visual sensation was like flying through a tunnel, with only a narrow strip of sky visible above her aircraft. Wind shear between the canyon walls created sudden jolts that required constant correction to maintain her flight path. Sarah found herself making continuous small adjustments to her controls, fighting to keep her aircraft centered in the passage while maintaining the speed necessary to preserve her momentum. The target array at Waypoint Bravo was positioned to simulate an enemy position that could threaten friendly forces during an extraction. Engaging it required a precise angle of attack that would minimize the risk of collateral damage while ensuring effective destruction of the threat. Sarah's gun run was executed with the precision that had made her famous in the close air support community. The target was obliterated by a carefully controlled burst that demonstrated both her marksmanship and her ability to maintain weapons discipline in challenging conditions. Target 2 destroyed. Proceeding to Waypoint Charlie. The approach to Waypoint Charlie presented the first truly intimidating challenge of the flight. The canyon narrowed to barely 300 feet wide while making a series of S-turns that would require Sarah to bank her aircraft to angles that seemed impossible at such low altitude. As she entered the first turn, Sarah felt her aircraft responding to the changed airflow patterns created by the confined space. The A-10's large, straight wings provided excellent lift at low speeds, but they also made the aircraft sensitive to the turbulent air currents swirling between the canyon walls. The second turn was even more challenging, requiring a bank angle of nearly 60 degrees while maintaining precise altitude and speed control. For a moment, Sarah felt as though she was flying her aircraft on the edge of a stall, with the margin between controlled flight and catastrophic loss of control measured in knots of airspeed and degrees of bank angle. But the A-10 responded to her touch with the predictability that had made it famous among pilots who flew dangerous missions. Even in conditions that would challenge a helicopter, the aircraft remained controllable and responsive to her commands. The target array at Waypoint Charlie represented the most challenging engagement yet, requiring Sarah to deliver ordnance while emerging from the complex series of turns. The timing had to be perfect, too early and she would miss the target, too late and she would overshoot the confined space available for the attack. Sarah's burst was perfectly timed and precisely aimed, destroying the target while demonstrating that effective weapons delivery was possible even in the most challenging flying conditions. Target 3 destroyed. Approaching Waypoint Delta. Waypoint Delta represented the ultimate test of both aircraft capability and pilot skill. The canyon narrowed to barely 200 feet wide while making a sharp 90-degree turn to the left. At the speed Sarah was flying, she would have to begin her turn before she could see around the corner, relying entirely on GPS navigation and her own spatial awareness. The approach to the turn was the most terrifying flying Sarah had ever experienced. The canyon walls seemed to be closing in from all sides, creating a sense of claustrophobia that challenged her professional composure. The sound of her engines echoed off the rock walls, creating an acoustic environment unlike anything she had experienced in normal flight operations. As she began the turn, Sarah felt her aircraft responding to control inputs that would have been considered extreme in any other flying situation. She banked the A-10 to nearly 90 degrees, using the canyon wall as a reference to maintain her orientation while GPS guidance told her when to roll out of the turn. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Sarah was flying her 30,000-pound aircraft as though it were a fighter plane, pulling G-forces that stressed both the airframe and her own physical limits. The rock walls flashed past her wingtips with clearances measured in feet, and she could see individual cracks and variations in the stone surface. Then, she was through the turn, emerging into a slightly wider section of canyon with her aircraft still under perfect control. The relief she felt was immediately replaced by the focus required for the final target engagement at Waypoint Delta. This target represented the most critical threat in the scenario, an enemy position that could prevent friendly forces from completing their extraction. Destroying it would require the most precise gun run yet, with minimal margin for error in both navigation and weapons delivery. Sarah lined up for the attack with the confidence that came from successfully completing the most challenging flying of her career. The target was positioned on a narrow ledge that would be difficult to hit under the best circumstances, but she had proven to herself that her aircraft and her skills were up to the challenge. The 30mm cannon delivered its devastating payload with surgical precision, obliterating the target while demonstrating that even the most challenging combat scenarios could be successfully executed using the extreme low-level flight profile. Target 4 destroyed. Proceeding to final simulation area. The concluding portion of the demonstration required Sarah to loiter in a confined area of the canyon system while providing simulated close air support for a ground extraction. This was perhaps the most demanding aspect of the entire flight, as it required sustained operations in conditions that most pilots couldn't survive for even a few minutes. For 10 minutes, Sarah flew a precise pattern in the confined canyon space, demonstrating that her aircraft could provide the sustained support that special operations missions required. She simulated multiple target engagements, evasive maneuvers, and coordination with ground forces, all while maintaining the extreme low-level flight profile that had been considered impossible. Throughout the loiter, her aircraft performed flawlessly, responding to her commands with precision that would have been impressive under normal circumstances and was extraordinary given the challenging conditions. The A-10's design characteristics that had been optimized for low-level operations proved their worth in the most demanding test they had ever faced. Finally, the demonstration phase was complete. Sarah climbed out of the canyon system with a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced in her military career. She had not only survived the flight but had proven that everything she had claimed was not only possible but practical for real combat operations. All monitoring stations, this is Viper 1. Demonstration complete, climbing to safe altitude for return to base. The radio calls that followed were filled with amazement and congratulations from observers who had witnessed something they had believed was impossible. Even Commander Thompson's voice carried a tone of respect that hadn't been present before the flight. Viper 1, this is Delta observation. That was the most impressive flying I've ever seen. You've changed my mind about what's possible out there. As Sarah flew back toward base, she reflected on the significance of what had just occurred. She had proven that the boundaries of military aviation were not as fixed as many people believed, and that innovation and skill could overcome limitations that had been considered absolute. But, more importantly, she had demonstrated that the mission Commander Thompson and his team needed to execute was not only possible but could be accomplished safely by properly trained and equipped aviators. The hostage rescue operation that had been considered too dangerous could now move forward with confidence. The landing was routine, but the reception waiting for her was anything but normal. As she taxied back to the flight line, Sarah could see crowds of personnel who had gathered to welcome her back from a flight that many had doubted she would survive. The post-flight celebration would be memorable, but, for Sarah, the most important moment came when Commander Thompson approached her aircraft as she shut down the engines. "Major," he said simply, "I owe you an apology. What you accomplished out there today changes everything we thought we knew about what's possible. Your mission is approved, and I'd be honored to have you provide air support for our operation." Sarah smiled as she climbed down from her aircraft, knowing that she had achieved something far more important than personal vindication. She had opened new possibilities for military aviation and had proven that impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been tried with the right combination of skill, preparation, and determination. The desert had witnessed the birth of a new chapter in military aviation history, and Major Sarah Martinez had written it with precision, courage, and an unshakable belief that limitations existed only until someone proved otherwise. 3 weeks after the demonstration that changed everything, Major Sarah Martinez found herself in a classified briefing room at a remote military installation, surrounded by the same special operations personnel who had once dismissed her capabilities as impossible fantasies. The atmosphere in the room was completely different now, charged with the focused intensity that preceded actual combat operations. The mission that had seemed impossible just a month earlier was now designated Operation Granite Rescue, and Sarah's role had evolved from skeptical observer to primary close air support asset. The hostages, 3 American aid workers who had been kidnapped while working in a region controlled by a particularly brutal terrorist organization, were being held in a compound located in terrain even more challenging than the Nevada canyons where Sarah had proven her capabilities. Commander Thompson stood at the front of the room, his manner transformed from skeptical challenger to confident mission commander. The successful demonstration had not only proven that the mission was feasible but had also established a level of trust and mutual respect between the Special Operations Team and their unlikely air support asset. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thompson began, "thanks to Major Martinez's demonstration, we now have a viable plan for extracting our personnel from what we previously considered an impossible situation. The terrain analysis has confirmed that the flight profile she demonstrated can be adapted to our operational area with acceptable risk factors. The target compound was located in a remote mountain region where the terrorists had chosen their position specifically because they believed it was beyond the reach of American military forces. The facility sat at the bottom of a narrow canyon surrounded by peaks that rose over 3,000 feet above the valley floor, accessible only through a winding passage that seemed designed to prevent any kind of conventional military approach. Previous attempts to develop a rescue plan had been frustrated by the terrain constraints. Helicopter operations were considered too risky due to the confined space and the certainty of enemy fire from elevated positions. Artillery and missile strikes were ruled out because of the risk to the hostages. Special operations forces could potentially reach the compound on foot, but extraction under fire would be nearly impossible without close air support. Sarah's demonstration had changed the equation entirely. Her flight through the Nevada Canyon system had proven that a skilled pilot in an A-10 could provide effective close air support in terrain that had previously been considered inaccessible to fixed-wing aircraft. More importantly, the sustained loiter capability she had demonstrated meant that air support could be maintained throughout the complex extraction process. The intelligence briefing painted a picture of a well-defended position manned by experienced fighters who had chosen their location specifically to neutralize American technological advantages. The compound included multiple buildings surrounded by defensive positions that provided overlapping fields of fire covering all approaches to the facility. "The enemy has positioned themselves perfectly to defend against conventional attacks," the intelligence officer explained. "They have heavy weapons positioned on the canyon rim that can engage helicopters, and they've prepared the compound to withstand artillery and airstrikes. What they haven't prepared for is close air support delivered from angles they consider impossible." The operational plan that emerged from weeks of detailed planning was audacious in its complexity and ambitious in its execution. A small team of special operations personnel would infiltrate the canyon system on foot, approaching the compound under cover of darkness. At dawn, they would begin their assault on the facility while Sarah provided close air support using the ultra-low flight profile that had become her signature. The challenges facing Sarah were even more daunting than those she had overcome during her demonstration flight. The operational area was located in hostile territory where enemy air defenses posed a constant threat. The canyon system was deeper and more complex than the Nevada training area, with unpredictable weather patterns that could change flying conditions without warning. Most significantly, this would be a combat operation where lives hung in the balance. The precision required would be even greater than what she had demonstrated during training, as the margin for error when friendly forces were in close proximity to targets was measured in feet rather than yards. Sarah spent 2 weeks preparing for the mission with an intensity that surpassed even her preparation for the Nevada demonstration. She studied detailed topographical maps of the operational area, memorizing every feature of the canyon system that could affect her flight path. Satellite imagery provided insights into the layout of the compound and the positioning of enemy defensive positions. The weather analysis was particularly concerning. The operational area was known for sudden changes in wind patterns that could create severe turbulence in the confined canyon space. Temperature variations could affect aircraft performance, and the possibility of low clouds or precipitation could reduce visibility to dangerous levels. Working with the mission planners, Sarah developed contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. Alternative flight paths were identified in case the primary route became untenable. Abort procedures were established that would allow her to extract safely if conditions became too dangerous. Communication protocols were developed to ensure coordination between air and ground elements throughout the operation. The weapons load for her A-10 was carefully chosen to provide maximum flexibility for the variety of targets she might encounter. Her primary weapon would be the 30mm cannon, which provided the precision necessary for engaging targets near friendly forces. Secondary weapons included small-diameter bombs that could be used against hardened positions without creating excessive collateral damage. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah worked extensively with the Special Operations Team to develop the communication procedures and target identification protocols that would be essential for successful coordination during the mission. The ground team would be operating in extremely dangerous conditions, and clear communication between air and ground elements could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. 5 days before the operation, Sarah deployed to a forward operating base that provided access to the target area. The base was a stark, utilitarian facility located in hostile territory where the constant threat of enemy action required exceptional security measures. Living conditions were Spartan, and the tension was palpable among personnel who understood that they were about to attempt something that had never been tried before. The final mission briefings took place in a secure facility where every aspect of the operation was reviewed in excruciating detail. Weather forecasts indicated acceptable conditions for the planned execution date, though the margin for safety was smaller than anyone would have preferred. Sarah's aircraft underwent the same meticulous preparation that had preceded her demonstration flight, with Master Sergeant Rodriguez and his team ensuring that every system was operating at peak performance. The crew chief's attention to detail was even more intense than before, understanding that mechanical failure during this mission could have catastrophic consequences not just for Sarah but for the entire rescue operation. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said as he completed his final inspection, "this bird is ready for anything you might encounter out there. She's never been in better condition, and she'll respond to whatever you ask of her." The night before the mission, Sarah followed her usual pre-flight ritual of quiet reflection and visualization. She mentally rehearsed every aspect of the planned flight, from the initial approach to the canyon system through the complex series of support missions that would be required during the extraction phase. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of narrow canyon passages and the constant awareness that tomorrow would test everything she had learned about the limits of aircraft performance and pilot capability. The weight of responsibility was enormous. 3 American lives depended on her ability to provide effective air support in conditions that most aviation experts still considered impossible. The wake-up call came at 0300 hours, beginning a day that would either validate everything Sarah believed about pushing the boundaries of military aviation or demonstrate the dangers of overconfidence in the face of physical limitations. The pre-flight briefing confirmed that weather conditions were within acceptable parameters, though winds in the target area were forecast to be variable and potentially challenging. Intelligence updates indicated no significant changes in enemy dispositions or defensive preparations. The Special Operations Team was already in position, having completed their infiltration during the previous night. Radio checks confirmed that communication was clear and that the ground team was ready to begin the assault phase of the operation. As Sarah walked to her aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, she felt the familiar transformation that occurred before every significant mission. The anxiety and uncertainty that had plagued her sleep gave way to the focused calm that had kept her alive through dozens of combat operations. The A-10 sat on the flight line like a predator waiting to be unleashed, its weapons loaded and systems prepared for the most challenging mission Sarah had ever attempted. Ground crews moved around the aircraft with quiet efficiency, completing final preparations while maintaining the security protocols required for operations in hostile territory. The engine start sequence proceeded normally, but Sarah was acutely aware that this routine procedure was the beginning of a mission that would test the absolute limits of what was possible in military aviation. Every system check was performed with exceptional care, understanding that there would be no opportunity for maintenance or repair once the mission began. Radio checks with all elements confirmed that the operation was ready to proceed. The Special Operations Team reported that they were in position and prepared to begin their assault on the compound. All monitoring stations reported ready to track the mission and provide emergency assistance if required. "Granite Rescue, this is Viper 1, Sarah radioed as she completed her final preparations. "Ready for mission execution. Viper 1, Granite Rescue. You are cleared to proceed. All elements standing by." The taxi to the runway felt different from any flight Sarah had ever undertaken. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and the margin for error was smaller than she had ever accepted. But she also felt the confidence that came from thorough preparation and the knowledge that she had already proven her capabilities under similarly challenging conditions. At the runway threshold, Sarah paused for a final systems check and a moment of reflection on the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. 3 American civilians were depending on her ability to provide air support in terrain that had been considered inaccessible to fixed-wing aircraft. A special operations team was risking their lives based on her assurance that she could deliver effective close air support in impossible conditions. Tower, Viper 1 ready for departure. Viper 1, cleared for takeoff. Bring them home. The takeoff was routine, but Sarah knew that routine was about to end very quickly. As she climbed away from the forward operating bays, she could see the mountainous terrain that contained the target area spreading out before her like a landscape designed specifically to challenge the skills of military aviators. The flight to the operational area took 45 minutes, during which Sarah reviewed her mission plan one final time and coordinated with the Special Operations team as they moved into their assault positions. The radio traffic was minimal but professional, reflecting the focused intensity of personnel who understood the gravity of their mission. As Sarah approached the canyon system that contained the target compound, she began her descent from safe altitude to the ultra-low flight profile that would define the entire mission. The transformation from conventional flight operations to the extreme flying that would be required was both gradual and dramatic, as the rules of normal aviation gave way to the unique demands of canyon flying. At 1,000 feet above the canyon floor, Sarah could see the narrow passage that would provide access to the target area. From her current altitude, the canyon looked manageable, but she knew that perspective would change dramatically as she descended into the confined space where she would spend the next several hours. 500 feet above the canyon floor, the character of the flight changed completely. The rock walls began to dominate her field of view, and the sensation of speed became overwhelming as the landscape rushed past her cockpit. Radio calls from the Special Operations team indicated that they were in position and ready to begin their assault. Granite Team, this is Viper 1 approaching the target area. Beginning low-level ingress for close air support. Viper 1, Granite Team copies. We are ready to initiate assault on your signal. At 100 feet above the canyon floor, Sarah entered a world that few pilots had ever experienced. The rock walls rose on either side of her aircraft like the walls of a cathedral, creating a sense of enclosure that was both beautiful and terrifying. The margin for error that had seemed abstract during planning became viscerally real as she realized that the next several hours would test every skill she had developed as a pilot. The approach to the target compound required Sarah to navigate through a series of turns and elevation changes that would challenge the performance limits of her aircraft. But the A-10 responded to her commands with the predictability that had made it famous among pilots who flew dangerous missions. As the target compound came into view around the final turn in the canyon, Sarah could see the Special Operations team moving into their assault positions. The moment of truth had arrived. It was time to find out whether the impossible mission could become an extraordinary success. Granite Team, this is Viper 1. Target area in sight. Ready to provide close air support on your command. Viper 1, Granite Team. Initiating assault now. Request immediate support on target building Alpha. The real mission had begun, and Sarah was about to discover whether her demonstration flight had been a preview of success or a prelude to catastrophe. The next few hours would determine not only the fate of 3 American hostages but also the future of ultra-low-level close air support operations in terrain that had previously been considered inaccessible to military aviation. The assault on the compound began at exactly 0630 hours, just as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the narrow canyon and illuminated the target buildings in stark relief against the surrounding rock walls. Major Sarah Martinez had positioned her A-10 at the mouth of the canyon, flying a tight orbit pattern that kept her aircraft ready to respond instantly to calls for fire support while remaining concealed from enemy observation points on the canyon rim. Granite Team, this is Viper 1. I have visual on target building Alpha. Standing by for immediate support. The radio crackled with the tense voices of the Special Operations team as they moved into their assault positions. Sarah could see them through her aircraft's targeting system, small figures moving with practiced precision through terrain that offered minimal cover and no room for error. Viper 1, Granite Team Leader. We have movement in Building Bravo, approximately 6 hostiles preparing defensive positions. Request immediate gun run on the north wall. Sarah banked her aircraft into the canyon system proper, diving toward the compound with the precision that had made her demonstration flight legendary. The target building was positioned against the canyon wall in a way that would require her to approach from an angle that seemed impossible for a fixed-wing aircraft. The 30mm cannon erupted with its characteristic growl, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds into the north wall of Building Bravo with devastating accuracy. The concrete and steel construction that would have provided excellent protection against small arms fire was no match for the A-10's primary weapon system. Direct hit on Building Bravo north wall, came the confirmation from the ground team. Multiple hostiles eliminated. Proceeding to Building Alpha where the hostages are believed to be located. The assault continued with the methodical precision that characterized Special Operations forces at their best. Each movement was calculated to minimize exposure to enemy fire while maintaining momentum toward the primary objective. Sarah provided overwatch, her aircraft circling at what would have been considered impossible altitude in any other circumstances. The enemy response was more organized than intelligence estimates had predicted. Heavy weapons positions on the canyon rim began engaging both the ground team and Sarah's aircraft with sustained automatic weapons fire. The confined space of the canyon amplified the sound of gunfire into a constant roar that was audible even over the noise of her engines. Viper 1, taking heavy fire from canyon rim positions. Need immediate suppression of targets at grid coordinates November 7-4. Sarah pulled her aircraft into a climbing turn that took her directly toward the enemy positions, using the A-10's armor and redundant systems to absorb the incoming fire while lining up for a gun run that would require her to fly directly between the canyon walls at an altitude that put her within easy range of enemy weapons. The attack was executed with surgical precision, eliminating 3 heavy weapons positions in a single pass that left the enemy's defensive capability significantly degraded. But the cost was evident immediately. Her aircraft had been hit multiple times, with several warning lights illuminating on her instrument panel. Granted team, this is Viper 1. I've taken multiple hits but aircraft is still flyable. Continuing close air support. The damage to her aircraft included hits to one engine and several flight control systems, but the A-10's legendary toughness allowed her to continue the mission even with significantly degraded performance. She adjusted her flight pattern to compensate for the damage while maintaining her ability to provide immediate response to calls for support. The breakthrough came 30 minutes into the assault when the ground team successfully breached the main building and located the 3 American hostages. All 3 were alive, though they had been weakened by months of captivity and showed signs of abuse at the hands of their captors. Viper 1, Granite Team Leader. We have secured the packages. All 3 are alive and mobile. Beginning extraction to primary landing zone. The extraction phase of the mission presented new challenges for Sarah's damaged aircraft. She needed to provide continuous overwatch for the ground team as they moved the hostages through nearly a mile of canyon terrain to reach the extraction point where helicopters would be waiting. The enemy was far from defeated, and scattered groups of fighters were attempting to organize a pursuit of the escaping Americans. Flying her damaged A-10 through the narrow canyon passages while providing fire support required every skill Sarah had developed over 8 years of combat flying. Her aircraft's reduced performance meant that maneuvers that had been routine during her demonstration flight now demanded her complete attention and exceptional precision. The first enemy counterattack came as the ground team reached a particularly narrow section of the canyon where they were vulnerable to fire from elevated positions. A group of fighters had positioned themselves on a ledge that provided excellent cover while offering clear shots at the Americans below. Viper 1 were taking fire from elevated positions to our east. Need immediate suppression. Sarah rolled her aircraft into a diving attack that took her between canyon walls with clearances measured in feet. The enemy position was eliminated with a precisely aimed burst from her cannon, but the maneuver stressed her damaged aircraft to its limits and triggered additional warning systems. The second counterattack was more serious, involving a larger group of enemy fighters who had managed to get ahead of the American ground team and establish an ambush position near the extraction point. The tactical situation was critical. The extraction helicopters were already inbound and couldn't wait indefinitely for the ground team to clear the opposition. Granite team, this is Viper 1. I can see the enemy position ahead of your